Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange. I'm Karima Brown. Dr. Ikoko, before the break, we were talking about the fact that there's no automatic correlation between democracy and development. And some people will argue that development itself is a process that introduces conflict in society because, in a way, it introduces a hierarchical way in which resources are introduced into very often poor communities. In countries in Africa where you have very weak infrastructure, where in some instances, like a place like Somalia or even Sudan, where sections of the state is in fact completely dysfunctional. How does one get this vision of South-South cooperation together that will enable African countries to participate in a much more clear and decisive way with other emerging markets like Brazil and India and so on?
Well, one thing that we have to realize is that South-South cooperation has three pillars: political one, economic, and technical one. And when we focus on the technical pillar, South-South cooperation remains possible even in fragile states. You have agricultural activity continue to happen in a state like Somalia. Is it possible then for Somalia or Somalians to have support from neighboring countries to help them in agriculture? Yes, there is. Is it possible to have young Somalians with scholarship to go to study into China or India? Yes, it is possible. Do we have facility put in place for Somalians, for instance, who are suffering from terrible diseases to come and get treatment in South Africa? Yes, it is possible. So those aspects of what we call TCDC remain possible even in cases of fragile states. Where it becomes difficult is when you need really good structure, a functioning central state that can facilitate, that can make sure that there is rule of law, that regulations are in place. Yet, some businesses manage to prosper.
Despite the absence of those regulations.
Manage to prosper in those countries. So it gives us the sense that even if conditions are not optimal, with strong will, with a little bit of commitment and ingenuity, it is still possible to advance the cause of South-South cooperation. By the way, South-South cooperation is also based on solidarity. And it is when countries are in trouble or that they are facing difficulties that solidarity should manifest itself.
When we talk about the pillars that you've outlined in terms of what underpins South-South cooperation and this question of solidarity being a key question, we often find countries of the South competing with each other. Let's take the African continent, for example. South Africa is obviously the strongest economy. Nigeria, is fast catching up, and there's often the attempt to kind of pit the economies against each other. South Africa is going to lose its favored status as the gateway. Nigeria is fast overtaking it, and so on. And of course, most countries develop trade policies that are in their own interests, and they will both act in solidarity, but also as competitors. To what extent do we have instruments on the continent that fosters intra-Africa trade, but also solidarity, where we are able to beef each other up, where we are weak in certain areas?
Okay. If you take the African Union with African Union Commission, you will see that there is a forum that allows countries to exchange and to try to move together, to try to grow together. Competition is natural, is a natural thing, and somehow you will hear that it even helps in some cases for countries to improve on their performance. What is not right is when this competition is destructive. when you have areas of competition and you also have areas of cooperation, it gives you allowance and opportunities to sit, to talk, and see how you move together. One thing that we should instead celebrate is to have more than one country which is growing fast. If we can have different poles of development on the continent, think of the Lagos plan, that was the whole idea, various sub-region with a pole of development and having some kind of concentric cycle around those countries. That was the idea. So I do not think that we should always oppose. However, it will be good for the continent to have some kind of regional, continental, broad policy framework. That does not necessarily constrain individual countries to do this, but at least that gives them some kind of guidelines. I recall that in 2006, talking about South-South cooperation and how the continent could eventually engage emerging powers and others. There was a working group that was set by African Union Commission, and that came up with a kind of broad policy framework, but that was not or has not yet been adopted by head of state. At least that was telling or giving countries of the continent broad ideas on how to engage with emerging economies. And it's very useful. For instance, we know that most investors that come in Africa are attracted by extractive sector. And yet, Africa has a capacity to transform some of this and add value to this. If it is accepted that it is a broad policy in Africa to transform a certain percentage on the continent, then countries will be in a better position to bargain when investors come. So it is possible.
But Dr. Ikoko, I think I would argue that there are encouraging signs that suggest that this vision is beginning to emerge, perhaps not as fast. I interviewed President Joyce Banda from Malawi recently, and she was saying that they've just discovered Malawi is rich in certain types of minerals, but she is instituting a study first to see that the way in which foreign investors come to Malawi is going to add value and is going to benefit Malawians. And of course, she's saying that they're going to be learning from others in South Africa, on the continent. And we know in South Africa, there's the big debate around what is called beneficiation, that we need to add to the value chain. We can't just have extractive-based economies. So certainly for me, certain African leaders are beginning to express that vision. The other encouraging sign one must obviously admit is the commitment to infrastructure development. We know SADC, for example, has endorsed the plan. And then, of course, also the tripartite arrangement where people are trying to formulate common markets, free trade arrangements. Are you seeing these initiatives as indications that people are finally getting to grips with having to get their house in order?
Well, I think that there are some encouraging signs. I see those signs mostly in some international institutions. When I think of my own organization, UNDP, UNDP has put in place a kind of project that support African countries in when they engage in negotiation for mining. At the level of African Union, there is something called African Mining Vision that was adopted in 2009. Again, trying to help and give broad guidelines to African countries. At the level of African Development Bank, there is also a facility that help African countries to use the best expert possible, Africans and non-Africans, so that they can take fully advantage of their mine wealth. But what is not encouraging enough is that this is not fast enough. It is always very, very difficult to renegotiate contracts that were signed. You recall what happened in Liberia when President Sirleaf Johnson came to power, and that she has to re-engage ArcelorMittal. It was not an easy task. So if the broad guidelines, the broad framework is in place, and that the head of states agree that, okay, we are going at least to look at those broad guidelines, and that we will make sure that we respect most of them, I think it will be a strong sign. It is good to learn from each other. Lesson learned, sharing knowledge, it is good, but I believe that it is better to have a broad guidelines, a broad framework that will even more empower our African governments in their negotiation, because it could always be that, you know, this is what Africa wants, and we cannot necessarily go beyond that.
Dr. Ikoko, we've been speaking a lot about the states on the continent and leaders and the elites having a vision or the lack of a vision. Let's talk about African business and of course their part in helping to shape this vision and influence government's approach to strengthening South-South cooperation. From where you're sitting, has African businesses matured to be able to assist their governments where they sing literally from the same hymn book on things like regulations and having this broad framework that you're talking about?
Well, yes and no. When you discuss with Africans who are involved in business, one thing you realize that they have really a strong will to engage in business. And when you look at the Forbes list today, you see Africans doing extremely well. Mr. Dangote in Nigeria is one of the richest people in the world today. So there is a lot of energy on the continent. What I see from my South-South cooperation lenses is that the business is being handled and conducted in the traditional way. And I don't think that Africa will necessarily, or Africans will necessarily win by playing with the rules that were there before. Yet, if they can play with the rules that are embedded in the South-South cooperation principle, I believe that they will be able to gain much more than what they are having today. Unfortunately, this has not happened. Maybe because they are not aware of those rules. Maybe they are not aware of those principles that are within what we call ECDC, economic cooperation among developing countries. And I think maybe your program will be a starting point for such a conversation with African business men.
We will certainly take you up on that, Dr. Ikoko. Thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. That's where we have to leave it for tonight. Join us again for another edition of Political Exchange. I'm Karima Brown. Goodbye.